So if you track your marketing numbers, it makes it really easy to figure out your marketing metrics, and that makes it really easy to improve your practice. In the last video, we talked about some of those metrics and how we can use them to figure out how to improve the practice. And in this video, we're going to be talking about how to track some of those harder to track metrics. That way we can figure out the metrics behind them and use them to improve the practice like we talked about in the last video. So let's go ahead and jump into figuring out how we can track our marketing numbers consistently. So here are some of the numbers that we talked about in the last video. And a lot of these can be found in our EHR. So these, for instance, can all be found in our EHR. This one can be found in our EHR. Depending on how we do it, consultations can also be found in it. And our total sales and marketing expense is also pretty easy to find. For our EHR numbers right here, if your EHR doesn't have these numbers, as we saw in the last video, it's really easy to improve the practice if we know the metrics. And these numbers are kind of required to figure out the metrics in order to improve the practice. And if you want to grow your practice, you kind of got to know your numbers. And so if your EHR doesn't track these numbers, then you honestly might want to consider swapping. Luckily, most EHRs do track these numbers, and there are a couple that it might not track just kind of off the bat. And so there would be some things that we need to set up in order to track these numbers. And so we will talk about that in this video. Now, some of these like consultations, the EHR might not have set up initially, but we will go over some ways of how we can track that. Also, where our new patients are coming from, that's another one that your EHR can probably track if you set it up properly. We'll go over that in this video. Some advanced numbers like website visitors, leads / prospects, which are people who are interested in the practice but aren't yet patients that we can contact. Those are leads / prospects. It's the same thing. And also scheduled leads. So these are people who, we can contact who are interested in our services and who have scheduled to come in for an appointment before they become a patient. These are all things that they might be a little bit harder to track, and they're probably not in your EHR. And so these are the kind of things that we will figure out in this video. So first of all, let's talk about tracking where your patients heard about you. It's easy to say, just ask them where they first heard about you whenever they come in, but that's not very helpful. And so I've got two kind of tactical ways that we can do this that hopefully are a little bit more helpful. So number one is just create a checklist of everything you do whenever someone first comes in. And you probably already have kind of a mental checklist of things that have to happen whenever they first come in. So for instance, you might greet them, ask them some questions so you can set them up as a patient in your EHR, that kind of stuff. And so basically we would want to take all of those steps and just write them out on a physical checklist and then insert a step in there of ask them where they first heard about you. And that way you can just follow the checklist every single time. And so it makes it easy to, one, keep your appointments consistent because you're following the same checklist every single time. It's easy to kind of shortcut stuff or forget things whenever you're following a mental checklist. But whenever you have it in front of you and you have to, check every single thing off whenever you're doing it, then it's a little bit harder to skip steps. And also what it does is when you hire people into your practice later, you already have the checklist ready, so you can be like, all right, this is the process we follow, and now they're on the same page with you. And also adding a step at any point is really easy because you have that same checklist and you just add a step and then you just follow the same thing. And so basically we just kind of want to have some kind of consistent reminder that reminds us to, ask the patient where they heard about us. This might be one of those things where, how different people have different productivity systems where maybe it's not quite for you, but hopefully it's a more tactical idea of how we can actually remember to ask patients where they first heard about us whenever they come in, as opposed to just saying, just do it and then good luck. Now, if you want a more automated method, then just having something on an intake form or surveys is probably the easiest thing to do. Some EHRs will have surveys that you can send out via email to your patients after they come in for an appointment. And so you would just set up like an automatic reminder basically to where after they come in for the appointment, you just send them an email and it says, hey, I have a quick, maybe it's 2-question survey for you. If you could answer it, really help me out, something like that. And you just set up 2 multiple choice things. I would do something like, where did you first hear about us? And then you have stuff like Google, Instagram, Facebook, a referral, other, that kind of stuff. And then the other thing I would do is what made you want to come in? And so then you could do referral, our Google reviews, our social media presence, something like that. And that way you can figure out what is the thing that is getting the most first touches in the practice. And then what is the thing that is ultimately convincing them to come in. Sometimes you'll have different kind of marketing tools that do different things. So you might have social media and that's where people see you first, but then they don't really become convinced to come see you until they look at your Google reviews. And so if you don't have one or the other, right, then it might significantly reduce the effectiveness of your marketing. And so that's kind of what we want to ask, where'd you hear about us? And then why'd you decide to come in? The reason we want to make it multiple choice is because it makes it a lot easier to go ahead and like codify everything whenever we're actually looking at stuff in, say, a spreadsheet. Because if if it's just an open box, then one person might say, I heard about you from Google, and the other person might just say Google. And so if we're looking at something like that in a spreadsheet and say we're trying to make some kind of graph out of it, right? We might have a bunch of people just say something simple like Google, and then a ton of other people saying some phrasing of, I heard about you from Google, right? All these different phrasings, and softwares aren't quite complex enough to be able to figure out that all these actually should just go in the Google bucket. And so that's why we want to make a multiple choice, because it just makes it really easy to sort all these things out. And then that makes it really easy to figure out, again, what is our most effective marketing. So the intake form, again, it's kind of the same thing where if you have any kind of paperwork that they need to do beforehand, just add a question in there, and I'd make it multiple choice again, so it's just super easy. And again, so it's easy for you to go ahead and codify everything later. Of these, the easiest thing to do would probably be to just send out the surveys regularly. The survey would probably be the easiest to do because it likely keeps a running total of all the answers. And so that way you just check the survey and say, okay, now I know, all my numbers. Otherwise, if we do the checklist or some kind of an intake form, we have to add it to their patient profile. And then we have to go through our patient list essentially in order to figure out the answer to that question. Now, that's not very hard, but if our survey already keeps track of all that for us and we can set it up automatically, then we might as well do that. So if you can do that, I'd probably recommend that one. Now, if you do free consultations before someone becomes a patient, and usually you do this for something like an ad. And so someone might see the ad and then they schedule a consultation, and then, you basically convince them to become a patient. If you do something like this, where we have the free consultation, then we want to track these consultations so we know what our conversion rate is from the consultations to appointments, and what our conversion rate is essentially from the ads to the consultations. So here, if you already have a software that you use for the consultation, so for instance, maybe use Calendly, and they go from your ad to a landing page to Calendly, then it's pretty easy because Calendly will already have all that. And if you only use Calendly as a consultation software, then, again, it's just really easy to go ahead and look at all of that and say, okay, here are my consultations for this period. And then as we'll see later, we'll figure out how many leads we have from the ads and other things. And then you can figure out the patients on the back end with your EHR. Now, if you just want to do it from your EHR, then what we basically want to do is we want to set up a consultation, basically appointment type in the EHR. So you might have something like, acupuncture, adjustment, right? Those kind of things. We want to set up a free consultation in the EHR, and that way we can track all our consultations. And then depending on how your software works, we could export this into Excel and then figure out how many people are no-showing for our consultations and stuff, and then how many people are becoming patients after that kind of stuff. Or your EHR might kind of just calculate all this stuff for you. But if you have consultations, then these are two ways we can track them. And like we talked about in the last video, we can use these consultations to figure out what our overall kind of throughput rate is, and the throughput rates of each step in our pipeline process in order to figure out how many people are becoming patients. And by the way, for scheduled leads, doing stuff like this is also how we'd want to go ahead and track our scheduled leads. So if you do stuff straight to an appointment, for instance, you might want to create a separate appointment type that is something like lead appointment or prospect appointment. That way we can track how many people are becoming leads from ads into scheduling into becoming a patient. If you just do consultations, then this is, really easy. But if you just go straight to appointments where no matter what they have to pay, right, which essentially means they have to become a patient, then I would probably set up a different kind so it's easier to track that, as opposed to having to remember the names of everyone who came in from ads. You can do that. It's just a little bit harder to kind of keep it all tracked in your mind, and it's a little bit more work. It says tracking our separate appointment types that we have for, if they're prospect to a prospect appointment to, a consultation, for instance, to a prospect appointment, whatever. If we have separate appointment types for this kind of things, then again, it just makes it really easy. All right, let's go ahead and look at how we can figure out how many leads we have. So to look at our Facebook leads, the first thing we want to go do is go to business.facebook.com, which takes us to the Meta Business Suite. We go to Insights over here on the side. And then the two things we want to look at are our leads right here and messaging. These are people that, we can contact our people from messaging, and we can contact our leads. Leads will be people from ads specifically, and messaging will be people who just decide to reach out to you or you reach out to them, etc. Either way, either of these could be leads, and so these are where we'd want to track them. Now, a quick note on this: as of the time of this recording, I don't believe Facebook removes people who are spam from our messaging contacts on here, or people who aren't wanting to become patients. You can add a lead tag to some of those conversations from the Meta Business suite. But obviously, if we forget to do that, then it doesn't really matter. And so you can go back through some of your messages and see, okay, maybe we had 30 messages, but 10 of those turned out to be spam. And so we can just go ahead and throw out those 10. We actually only have 20. Or if you have about the same number of spam or other conversations on your messaging, then you could just keep that number the same. And we could just say, keeping our same numbers, out of every 3 conversations, 2 of them are leads. So we could just go ahead and factor the spam and other messaging in there if we want to. And then what we'd want to do is we want to go over here and go ahead and grab them for both Facebook and Instagram. Alternatively, what we could do for Facebook leads specifically is we could go to the Facebook Ads Manager, which is adsmanager.facebook.com, and then we could check out our leads. So if we have them on Facebook, we could check out our on Facebook leads. And if we do them on, say, a landing page, then we want to go ahead and check out our landing page form submissions. Sometimes Facebook will track our landing page form submissions depending on how we have our MetaPixel set up and that kind of stuff. But a lot of times you'll have some that are falling through that Facebook just doesn't pick up. And so we'd want to go ahead and just track the number of people we have on our landing page or website for Facebook specifically, and sometimes for something like Google Ads. But at least for Facebook specifically, sometimes it can be easier to track all our pipeline metrics while we're actually running the campaign. So we can see here we have our 40 on Facebook leads, and these are people who submitted a form on Facebook from our ads. What it might be easier to do is just go ahead and look at all our tech stack. So we have our lead form submissions, and then let's just say we call all of them, and we have our consultation set up. We have however many become patients. And so if we just have our tech stack set up, we know that we have our consultations set up for the month in our EHR, for instance. And so here we have 40. We then call everyone, and let's say of these, let's say 20 schedule a consultation, and we are tracking this in the same month, right, in our EHR. And so it's really easy to just see, it's like, okay, we have 40 on Facebook in the same month period on our EHR. We can see we have 20 of these consultations, and we only set up consultations for people on ads. And then of those, whenever they come in, it's kind of easy to just keep it in the back of your mind and say, okay, this is someone that came from this ad. They turn into a patient. And so maybe we have, 10 of these people turn into patients. And so sometimes if you're in the moment of tracking all this, if we just look at the same month, sometimes it can be a lot easier to figure everything out if we just go ahead and track it like this. Now, sometimes, it's a little bit hard to kind of track everything like this while everything else is going on. And so that's where we would just go and look back at all of our data like we have it set up. But if we do have everything set up like we talked about in this video, then in the future, it can be pretty easy to just kind of track it as we are going along because we have all the systems set. So basically, to recap this, from ads specifically, we would check out our leads on our Meta Business Suite or our Ads Manager, or we check out them from the landing page, depending on how we have it set up. And we could also check out messaging, and we just kind of tally all of these up for our leads and put them into a big bucket. Now for Google Ads, is a little bit different because sometimes Google will consider conversions to be things that we might not consider people to be leads, for instance. So for instance, sometimes someone will use our ads to figure out where our location is. They'll use map direction, and Google might consider that a conversion, but then we might not consider that a conversion because we don't know who it is and we can't consider them a lead. So what I would do specifically is I would just go ahead and lump it all in there, similar to how we would lump our spam things and whatnot into the same thing, and then just get a rough idea. Now, the way that we would look at our either conversions or leads or whatever is we'd go to our Google Ads dashboard and we click this metrics thing right here, and we go to conversions, and then we either have conversion actions here or conversion category. Usually we don't want to mix these two because then we'll get doubled up. And so you might have to kind of play around with these to figure out, depending on how you have your Google Ads set up and your Google Analytics and all those other things, you may have to play around with these a little bit in order to figure out what your conversions and leads metrics are for you. So for this one specifically, for instance, usually what we consider to be leads are something like these business profile calls or calls from smart campaigns. We can click apply here. So as an example of that, you can see here we have business profile calls set up. We have calls from smart campaigns, and we have calls from ads. And these are actually all smart campaigns, but for whatever reason, they're showing up as calls from ads. And so you may have to play around with it to see what consistently shows up as your calls or leads or whatever. So either way, once we figure out all our conversion or lead metrics on Google Ads, we go ahead and track these and then put them in a spreadsheet and go do the metrics that we talked about in the last video. Now, like I said earlier, depending on how you have things set up, you may have all of your metrics just put in one thing. So for instance, right here, we can see we have business profile calls here. And on here, it's not tracking anything, but sometimes we might have a doubling up of data depending on how we have things set up. So for instance, if we go to our business profile, our Google business profile, we can click here, we can see performance, and we can click and see calls. And so we can see that you can see your calls here, for instance. And sometimes you might have the exact same calls showing up on Google Ads. Again, it just kind of depends on how you have things set up. And so we may want to include our calls from our Google business profile over that period of time. And we may just want to all lump it into Google Ads. You know, it kind of depends on you. I would personally just lump all of this stuff under a Google category. And then that way we could just have our Google category of, you know, Google Ads and Google business profile and whatever else. You can break it and do a subcategories if you want, but I would just go ahead and lump it all into Google category so we have an overall idea. And then if we want to get more granular, we can try, but you know, sometimes it's a little bit hard with this, but I would do stuff like that. And websites, your website click to calls might also be something where this again would show up on Google Ads as opposed to on the website. So speaking of the website, depending on how your website's set up, it may automatically track it for you. So for instance, on this one, you can see it already has site visits and engagements with our click to calls already set up. But on other ones, we may have to set up Google Analytics on our site in order to track our site visits and our calls and whatever else. It's also worth noting that click to calls aren't always the same thing as actual calls from the website, because usually what happens is the moment someone presses that button, even if they don't make a call, it counts as a click to call. So theoretically, someone could click it and then they say, actually, I don't want to call yet. And they cancel, they scroll your website a little bit further and they click it again. And so then you'd see 2 click to calls, but actually you'd only have 1 call. And so don't always take click to calls as something that's the hard truth. So if you see a lot of fluctuation on your website, I wouldn't get too hung up on it, just because, like I said, you can see a lot of fluctuations depending on how people interact with your click to call button. So those are some of the things that we do with clients in order to help them figure out the marketing metrics and stuff. And so hopefully those ideas are helpful for you, and hopefully you can implement them in your practice. If you want help implementing those things, so this is what we do with clients: is we implement tracking, we go through the numbers for them like we talked about in the last video, and then we implement improvements based on what those numbers say. So if you want help with that, I'll leave a link at the top of the description. You can go ahead and schedule a free consultation and we can talk about it. Otherwise, I hope this video was helpful, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.